Hunger's running the show. What's the next step? How do we engage with this hunger piece in a healthy way now that we understand the framework?
Yeah, so there's 3 different types of hunger. So in the hunger code, I go through the 3 different types of hunger and basically how to deal with them. So I go over sort of 3 golden rules, and there's like 50 weight loss tips. So you have to take each one separately because each one is a different problem. So if your problem is homeostatic hunger, then of course, then you have to deal with it. So you have to think about the process that goes from food to weight gain. And everybody thinks it's, oh, calories to weight gain. No, that's so superficial again. Foods don't cause weight gain. You can only gain weight when your hormones tell you to gain weight, right? So, you think that when you eat food, it automatically goes into storage. No, your body could either store it or burn it, right? So if you take the energy balance equation, let me say body fat, which is a store of calories, equals, calories in minus calories out. That's fine. It's just like your bank, right? Your bank is a store of money, just like your fat is a store of calories. So your bank equals money in minus money out, right? But saving more money isn't the same as making more money, right? They're 2 separate things. Same as calories. If you eat more calories or less calories, it doesn't mean you'll save more or less. They're separate. They're controlled separately. If a bank is closed and you make more money, you don't save any because, it's just sitting out there, right? So the point is that if you rewrite this equation and say, instead of body fat equals calories in minus calories out, you say calories in equals body fat plus calories out. What it tells you is that for every calorie you eat, your body can either store it or burn it. And which one does it do? It's not the number of calories that matters. It's what your body does with those calories, right? And that's all about the hormones. So the main one is insulin. The other thing that's important is that once you realize it's all about the hormones, then you realize that the body fat percentage is controlled like a thermostat, right? It's not just here's the leftover stuff, take it and store it. Your body actively controls how much body fat you carry. And this is called homeostasis. This is why it's called homeostatic hunger. Homeostasis is a concept which is true for so many systems in the body. Essentially, your body controls a variable. And when it gets out of range, it activates processes to get back. So body temperature, for example. Your body temperature is roughly, 97 degrees. And if you live in the Sahara Desert and it's very hot, then you're going to sweat and you're going to cool it down so you get back to that level. If you live in the North Pole where it's very cold, you're going to shiver and generate heat and bring yourself back up, right? So even though you could say body temperature equals heat in minus heat out, that's not how the body controls it, right? It doesn't go putting in extra heat like willy-nilly, right? It doesn't throw extra heat. Oh, here's some extra heat. Your body temperature will go up. No. You want a set body temperature and you actively regulate to get there, okay? Just like your room thermostat, right? So your room temperature is the same. When you set the room temperature 72 degrees, say, and when it gets too hot, it activates the air conditioning. And when it gets too cold, it activates the heat, right? So it doesn't heat it itself, but it activates ways to heat it up. And this is true for so many different systems in the body. So salt, if you eat a lot of salt, you'll pee out a lot of salt. If you don't eat a lot of salt, you won't pee out a lot of salt, right? In either way, your sodium level stays stable. You could look at, any of the electrolytes, potassium. You could look at, body temperature, light. When you go into a bright room, your pupils will narrow. When you go into a dark room, your pupils will dilate. Either way, you want to keep this steady light coming in so that you're able to see. So the homeostasis is true for all mission critical systems, and body fat is the same. So body fat, people say, and a lot of people say, oh, we're designed to store fat. So now that food is so easy to get, we're all doomed to get fat. That's completely wrong. It has no basis in science whatsoever. There's no proof of that because think about it. If you're a wild animal and you carry too much body fat, you're going to die. Simple as that. If you're a predator, you can't catch anybody. If you're a prey animal, you will get caught very quickly and you will die. Okay? If you carry too little body fat, you'll never survive the winter. So you're going to die. So it's a mission critical system. So how much body fat you carry is set. So when you go into a room that is too hot, you don't say, oh, heat in must be greater than heat out. It's like, no, you'd say, why did somebody set the thermostat so high? Let me turn it down. So the body fat is the same. There are certain hormones that push it up, and there are certain hormones that push it down. How do we know this? Well, we have drugs that are very similar to these natural hormones, and when we give it, body weight goes up. Insulin is the prime example. You give somebody insulin, their body fat goes up. It doesn't matter how much they eat because your body has two levers, just like the room has air conditioning and cooling, right? Your body can adjust your food intake through hunger, or it can adjust your basal metabolic rate, which is your calories out, so that it gains weight. Basically, if you give somebody a lot of insulin, you're telling their body, gain fat, store more fat. You're pushing that body fat thermostat up. Now, if you eat the same amount of calories, your body's like, hey, I can't gain any fat if I stay the same, so I'm going to push my basal metabolic rate down. I'm going to burn less. And guess what? Every single scientific study of weight loss has shown exactly the same thing. As you lose weight, your basal metabolic rate goes down. So the point is that if we can experimentally make somebody fat, we know that we're pushing up the body fat thermostat. So insulin is one of these hormones that pushes it up. Cortisol pushes it up. What pushes it down? Well, GLP-1s push it down. GIP pushes it down. How do we know that? Ozempic. Ozempic is a classic satiety hormone, glucagon-like peptide, and glucagon, of course, is like the opposite of insulin, basically. So when you stimulate glucagon, you're basically stimulating the opposite hormone of insulin, and you lose weight. And we all know from so many studies that GLP-1s, Ozempic, does cause weight loss as long as you stay on it. Why? Because you're pushing that body thermostat down. But there are other ways to stimulate GLP-1. It's a natural hormone. Protein, for example, will stimulate GLP-1. Fiber will stimulate GLP-1. There are lots of different ways. GIP is part of the drug Mounjaro, for example, and it's more effective because it affects both GLP and GIP. There's a third one, glucagon. You could use glucagon directly, and a third drug that is under development also stimulates that. The other thing is if you activate the sympathetic nervous system, so adrenaline and noradrenaline, it pushes the body fat thermostat down. So if you think about the sympathetic nervous system, it's actually part of the autonomic nervous system, which is, basically runs all the autonomic functions or automatic functions. The sympathetic tone is the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic, which is the other part, is the sort of rest and relaxation. If you give amphetamines, which are stimulants, and stimulates or noradrenaline. So amphetamines were classically called speed. That was the old street name. They were actually used in the 60s and 70s as weight loss drugs. So crack, cocaine, methamphetamines, right? Amphetamines, they were used for weight loss. Why? Because they belong to a class of drugs called anorexiants. Right? People think, oh, you're burning more calories. No, you're killing the appetite. When people take speed, their appetite just dies. And it is very effective because the sympathetic tone pushes the thermostat down. Your body's like, oh, I need to, lose some of this body fat. I'm going to turn off my hunger because that's how it affects, that's the actuating. That's just like the thermostat using the air conditioning or heating, right? The thermostat doesn't control it, but it activates hunger or deactivates hunger, right? So that's what sympathetic nervous system does. So the old drug fen-phen, which is fenfluramine, phentermine, did the same thing, stimulated the sympathetic tone. Weight loss was 17% of body weight, on par with the modern miracle weight loss drugs, Ozempic, right? Nicotine is a sympathetic stimulant. So when you smoke, your appetite goes down. It's real. Everybody knows it. It's been well documented. Smokers weigh less than non-smokers. Why? Because they're killing their appetite. They've got the sympathetic stimulation. You're pushing that thermostat down. So there's lots of hormones that do this. There's testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, for instance, thyroid hormone. There's baroreceptors in the stomach that do this, the vagus nerve, dopamine, so reward systems, for example, serotonin, insulin, cortisol, leptin, ghrelin. That's like all these different hormones. Some of them push it up, some of them push it down. Where it winds up is how you determine it. And that's why, and again, this data has been around for like 50 years. That's why if you have two people, for example, you have somebody who's always who weighs 150 pounds, but always weighed 150 pounds or 160 pounds, right? And you have a person who weighed 200 pounds and lost weight to 160 pounds. Those two people are very different. The one who's always been 160 pounds does not struggle to maintain his or her weight. The one who used to weigh 200 pounds and then goes down to 160 struggles mightily. Their hunger is off the charts. Their metabolic rate falls. Why? Because your body is trying to go back up. The thermostat's set at 200 pounds and you're at 160. So the thermostat's like, I need to activate hunger. And if you're not going to eat more, I'm going to turn down your metabolic rate. And the differences have been well documented. I mean, I was reading studies from the early 80s that were showing exactly this phenomenon. And you can't understand it unless you understand the body fat thermostat. There's studies by Dr. Leibel in the New England Journal in the 90s where he simply took somebody, force-fed them, made them gain weight. As they gained weight, their metabolic rate went up. Why? Because their thermostat was down here. Your weight is up here, so it activates the metabolic rate to try and burn off those calories. As he returned them to the normal weight, metabolic rate came down. As they lost weight, their metabolic rate kept going down. Again, why? Because the thermostat's up here, your body weight's down here, you activate hormonal hunger, you get hungry. If you don't eat still, because this is a controlled situation, it turns down the metabolic rate so that your weight will go back up, just like a thermostat. In fact, you can't understand any study in obesity medicine unless you understand the body fat thermostat.
So it sounds like when it comes to this body fat thermostat, it's either permanent or semi-permanent by the examples you just gave. So in that example where somebody went from 200 down to 160 and their body is trying to push them back up because that's their new normal, does that ever become a new normal at that new weight of 160?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, because you just have to, it's all the balance of hormones, right? So if you're eating foods that are just stimulating insulin, you're pushing it way up. So even if you cut your calories, but you've kept that insulin levels way up here, you're going to want to keep it up there because that's what the thermostat showed. But if you activate GLP-1s, for example, with Ozempic, or if you activate it with, speed or fen-phen or something like that, or nicotine, you're going to push it down and then you're going to defend that lower weight. But now you're working with your body, right? And that's the key. That's why you have to always focus on what's going on in the hormones. And the hormone that's most important is the insulin. And the insulin is the one that's most responsive to food because a lot of these other things, many of them are like genetically determined and so on. So thyroid, you can't do much about. Testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, you can't do much about, right? I think the clearest demonstration for the sex hormones, just to deviate for a second, which I always think is interesting, how nobody ever talks about this. But if you think about pre-puberty, boys and girls have roughly the same level of body fat. After puberty, girls have about 50% more body fat. Well, why? Why should that be? Is it willpower? Is it calories? Like, have you seen how many calories a teenage boy eats? It's not calories. I mean, they clean you out. Your fridge is empty, right? They're eating everything in sight. So why do they have 50% less body fat? Why? Because their hormones told them to. So when girls go through puberty, they get estrogen and progesterone, which gets them ready for, fertility. So they store fat subcutaneously in their breasts and their hips. That's because their hormones told them to. Boys, because they have a lot of testosterone, will use it to build a lot of muscle. And they'll be very active and they'll do all kinds of stupid things, right? But that's because of the testosterone. That's basically what it is. So, why do we pretend that this body fat is all about willpower and calories, right? These two people, a boy and a girl, as they go through puberty, could eat the exact same calories. And it's actually not even close because boys, I think, truthfully, eat way more calories than girls. But even if they ate the same calories, they would have very, very different levels of body fat because it's under hormonal control, because it's this body fat thermostat. Girls get it pushed way up here because that's what the estrogen progesterone tells it to do. So the point is that the insulin is the main factor under our control, because testosterone, estrogen, thyroid hormone, those sympathetic tone, those are not so easy to control. But insulin is, because different foods stimulate different levels of insulin. So if you have a lot of insulin, what's insulin's job? Well, to tell you to store more body fat. It's literally one of its main jobs. And so if you have foods, if you eat a food that stimulates a lot of insulin, you're going to store more body fat. And again, I don't know why people pretend it's different. It's crazy. Let's take two foods, for example. Say you eat 800 calories. You eat a 3-egg omelet with a vegetable omelet in the morning. Pretty big breakfast. You're going to be full at least until lunch and maybe till dinner, because I've had, these at resorts and stuff, and I couldn't eat until dinner time. Okay, so you have 800 calories, but very little insulin release. So therefore, you don't store it. So remember, if we go back to the energy balance equation, which is calories in equals body fat plus calories out, or you have 800 calories, do you store it or do you burn it? Since you have very little insulin, you don't store it, and all those 800 calories are floating around. That's why I'm full till dinner time. Now, on the other hand, if I were to drink 800 calories of a Frappuccino, I'd be hungry 5 minutes later. Why? Well, it's all refined carbohydrates and sugar. My insulin spiked way up. All of it went into storage, and none of it was sitting out for my body to use. So 5 minutes later, my muscles, my liver, my kidney are like, hey, go eat something, man. I got nothing, because all the calories went into storage. Okay, so we all know this is true, right? So why pretend that a calorie is a calorie? Those two calories were dramatically different because of the hormones, and that's the homeostatic hunger. And so there's lots of ways that you can affect the insulin response, even to the same foods, actually. So this is what's quite interesting, because everybody says, oh, then you just eat less carbohydrates. Yes, you could do that. But it's not just that, because there's a whole process, and in the hunger code, in the section on homeostatic hunger, I go through the whole process. It goes from the foods, and then digestion. So remember, you have to digest the food to prepare it for the next step. So it goes into the stomach churns it about and then releases it slowly into the intestines. In the intestines, you absorb it into the bloodstream. And once it gets into the bloodstream, that stimulates or suppresses various hormones, which then affect how much weight you gain. So it goes from the food to the digestion, to the absorption, to the hormones, to the weight loss, weight gain. And I list like 10 things that affect digestion and like 10 things that affect absorption, and there's like 12 or 13 different hormones. So if you think about the different permutations of that, there's a tremendous amount of variability on where you can do. You could eat the same food, for example, and they've done these very interesting studies where they look at, say, an apple. You take apple slices, and then you can turn it into applesauce. So you could take apples, bake it, blend it, and then that's applesauce. But remember, you started with the apple and didn't add or subtract anything. So the nutrients in the whole apple and the applesauce are identical, right? So the difference is that when you eat the apple, it's harder to digest, so it stays in the stomach longer. And by staying in there longer, it keeps you full longer because it's sitting in the stomach, right? It gets released into the intestines, but the particles are big. So therefore, it gets absorbed slower. So the glucose spike you see with applesauce is much higher than you see with whole apples, in which case you get this blunted glucose effect, which lowers your insulin effect. Same food, same calories, same everything, but the way you process them changes the hormonal response because of the difference in digestion and absorption. Another interesting one, for example, would be food order. You can take the same food, and this experiment was fascinating. They took somebody and they basically gave them orange juice and bread or chicken and vegetables. And they switched the order. So one group would eat, say, bread and orange juice, and then 10 minutes later, chicken and vegetables. Then they'd, have the same person and they'd flip them and they'd measure their insulin and so on. Then they'd flip them and have somebody eat chicken and vegetables and then flip it over and have them take the bread and orange juice last. So either carbs first or carbs last. And the difference was huge. The difference in the insulin response, the glucose response, which are similar, was like 50% lower. It was like crazy. And it's like, think about it. When you eat the bread and orange juice first, what goes down, it gets churned in the stomach starts pumping out this bread and orange juice into the intestines. That's 100% refined carbohydrates, right? So it goes through quickly. It doesn't stay in the stomach very long. And then it gets to the blood for absorption, and the absorption spike just shoots right up. So you have a huge insulin response. When you eat chicken and vegetable first, what happens is that in the stomach, you got the chicken and vegetables, and they're mixing, and they're big, and they're clunky, and they're hard to sort of digest. So the stomach's holding it, it's churning it. Now you put the bread and the orange juice in. What goes into the intestines is a bit of chicken, a bit of vegetables, a bit of bread, and a bit of orange juice, right? You're not getting 100% glucose, which is carbohydrates. So absorption is slower, insulin peak is lower. So same food, exactly the same foods, but the way you eat them, the food order, makes a difference because it's the hormonal response that dictates what it is. So it's not necessarily the calories or the carbs. It's so much more complicated than that. And we've done all this physiologic research over the last 100 years. And yet when it comes down to weight, everybody insists on throwing all that knowledge out and saying, it's all calories. It's like, no, there's all this interesting physiology. And of course, if you're trying to lose weight, then you can use that. Instead of eating bread at the beginning of the meal, you say, can you please bring that in the middle of my meal so that you can eat it after? So even if you want to eat that bread because it's sort of delicious in those restaurants, have them bring it after, eat it after. It's no big deal because you're still going to eat it, you're still going to enjoy it, but you're not going to get the same effect, right? Same thing if you compare like bread, plain bread versus bread with vinegar. Again, much lower glucose response because the vinegar actually inhibits the breakdown of the carbohydrate. So again, instead of having bread by itself, dip it in some olive oil and vinegar, right? So easy things that can change. It's about having a low insulin diet, not necessarily a low carbohydrate diet, because it can still be done. So those are some of the tips, the weight loss tips that I have in the book. I mean, there's like 50 of them, right? So there's a whole lot of physiology in the book. There's a whole lot of discussion of what affects the insulin levels, digestion, absorption. And truthfully, I've never seen this discussed in any other book. Honestly, it's like I read a lot of dietary books and like 90% of them are about calories. Like, what about these processes? What about hunger? What about digestion? What about, hedonic hunger? What about ultra processed foods? What about food addictions, right? There's so many more things that we need to talk about because it's about the totality of the eating behavior, not just the foods.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
Different foods stimulate different levels of insulin. What's insulin's job? Well, to tell you to store more body fat. If it's chronically high, you're going to gain a lot of weight because you're moving a lot of glucose into the cells. They're going to fill up so that glucose